to the IISS Webinar Combating Violence and Organized Crime in Megacities. My name is Virginia Comolli. I'm the Research Fellow for Security and Development here at IISS. Many large and megacities of the developing world are affected by chronic criminal violence, high homicide rates, and sometimes even urban terrorism. Indeed, the term fragile city has been used in recent years to describe areas such as Caracas, Mogadishu, and Karachi, among others. Here, government authority is being directly challenged by armed groups in slums and chaotic urban peripheries. Faced by growing urban challenges, local security forces had to develop new and innovative approaches, and this is the subject of today's webinar. The Security and Development Program is developing a new strand of work in this area, and today we are lucky to be hearing Antônio Sampaio's assessment of initiatives implemented in some key cities. Antônio is the Research Associate for Security and Development. A former journalist, he focuses extensively on non-state threats and their effect on social and economic development. Following his presentation, we will open up the floor to your questions. The easiest way for you to ask a question is via the chat function. You can do that right now or at any point during the presentation. The questions will come through to me, and I will then read them out and put them to our speaker. But without further ado, I would now like to hand over to Antônio.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, everybody, for listening today. My aim today is to lay out a few trends in urban law enforcement initiatives, mainly from Latin America, and explain how they may be viewed as an emerging framework for looking at security policies in cities. Latin America has been called a laboratory for urban security policies, and this is sadly an accurate assessment. The aim today is not to focus exclusively on Latin America, but it is useful to look at the Latin American examples for many reasons. Latin America has approximately 80% of its population living in cities. This is far more than any other developing region or sub-region. As a consequence, urban sprawl and lawless peripheries and slums have added to the stress factors linked to organized crime in order to create situations of protracted violence. For that reason, I consider Latin America a basket case and a warning to other regions. Urbanization rates in Africa and Asia are currently below 50%, but are increasing fast, and its cities will face similar pressures. The urgency of looking at experiences and innovation in urban security stems from the demographic trends in developing countries. Regions facing faster urban expansion, urban population growth, are also some of the most fragile or violent. This is the case, for instance, of Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Africa's urban population is forecast to triple and Asia's to grow by 61% by 2050, according to the UN. The consequence is what UN Habitat calls a global wave of peripherization, sprawling areas or slums with informal land arrangements, often marginalized and insecure. The world's slum population is already at 863 million, and according to the World Bank, is forecast to increase by 500 million people by 2020. Urbanization leads to economic and social benefits, but what we are seeing with increasing frequency is the combination of urban lawlessness and transnational crime, leading to what researchers like Robert Muga call endemic urban violence. UN Habitat, in a study from 2014, warned about autonomous and no-go zones, such as slums and other informal settlements that effectively, and I quote, lie outside local and central government control in regions like Africa and South Asia. Latin America has been hit hardest. 43 of the world's 50 most violent cities in 2014 are in Latin America. Globalized legal economies such as drug trafficking, informal mining, extortion, and human trafficking converge in places such as Buenaventura, the port city in Colombia, Ciudad Juárez on the border between Mexico and the US, or Lázaro Cárdenas, the Mexican coast, or Rio de Janeiro. These are key economic hubs that have seen sharp rises in criminal violence and gang warfare in recent decades. Hence, the dilemma that is the main research question that I'm trying to answer: how to find the correct calibration of security and development tools in densely inhabited but also disputed urban areas. In terms of law enforcement, there is a clear tendency towards militarization and the overall use of force. Brazil has its military police. Honduras has implemented a similar body recently. Mexico's recently created Gendarmerie is a paramilitary force for internal law enforcement. El Salvador has recently deployed elite anti-crime army units, and the list goes on. But recent experiences in key cities that have experienced sharp drops in their homicide rates also show a growing acceptance of joint security and peace-building approaches in a framework that I see as an emerging form of stabilization operations. And I think that is the main point that I want to make today, this growing, emerging stabilization framework in cities. This stems from a reassessment of the role of armed force in achieving security results in cities. Or to use a term more in line with the literature around stabilization, the utility of force in cities. If we take two cities that have become case studies in urban security change in South America, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and Medellín in Colombia, we observe not only tactical changes towards a less aggressive posture by police, by the army, but also conceptual change. Armed force, be that by the military or by the various paramilitary or police agencies, is to be applied in order to support a broader peace-building effort. This is hardly a groundbreaking discovery, but its practical application had eluded Latin American cities even as they struggled for decades with endemic armed violence. I will explore now the two examples I just cited, starting with Medellín, not only because its security strategy came before Rio, but also because Rio authorities were influenced by it. As anyone hooked to the new Netflix series Narcos can tell, Medellín has a long and bloody history with criminal violence. The start of the law enforcement shifts that would help stabilize the city can be traced to the early 2000s, when Medellín played an important role in the US supported efforts to turn the tide against the guerrillas and drug cartels planned Colombia. The armed forces were used with extensive support from Black Hawk helicopters in order to occupy key slums known there as comunas. The influx of military and police forces in the city succeeded in expelling most of the guerrilla groups and was followed by agreements in the criminal underworld that allowed for a temporary stability. This opportunity was seized by local authorities who implemented policies that are now famous, building libraries, schools, cable cars to connect the slums to the city, and even placing bold architectural works inside some of the most fragile communities. The overarching aim was to use a broad range of state tools, including a limited amount of armed force, to stabilize volatile communities and create the conditions for longer-term development. A study by the University of Antioquia concluded that the comunas connected by public transportation works saw a 66% drop in homicides between 2003 and 2008. The foundation for these inspiring peace-building initiatives was a significant reinterpretation of urban law enforcement. The police received state-of-the-art technology to connect its outposts placed throughout the slums and other places of the city. Virginia and I visited recently the command center that the Security Secretariat there uses to monitor and coordinate efforts every day. The main control room is quite impressive, but what called my attention the most was the people that were there. As we walked past the computer terminals, we were greeted by employees of the fire brigade, health services, traffic control, police, the armed forces, among other agencies. It was a huge room. So the greatest security change in Medellín was not the technology acquired, but the successful integration of different civilian and military institutions around the goal of stabilizing the city. Today, joint patrols and operations by army and police, supported by surveillance aircraft from the Air Force, for instance, are routine. This model of joining forces and creating the stability necessary for broader development attracted the attention of other cities. Mainly among them was Rio de Janeiro. There we see a very different background, but also remarkable similarities in the application of military, law enforcement, and peace-building measures, and an equally significant reassessment of the role of force. The example of Rio is especially interesting because it applies some of the lessons from Medellín in a much larger scale, a metropolitan area with 11 million inhabitants, and in a situation of endemic violence that had been the status quo for at least since the 1980s. Like in Medellín, the slums, or favelas, had historically lacked effective state presence, public services, and infrastructure. Three main groups, most notably the Red Command, had the willingness and the heavy caliber weaponry to control slums and intimidate local populations, turning entire parts of the city into no-go areas for outsiders. Forced with the challenge of implementing two major sporting events, the Olympics and the World Cup, or perhaps in the inverse order, the World Cup and then the Olympics, the government of Rio de Janeiro state started in 2008 a pacification program in slums, consisting on the permanent police presence, followed by improvements in public services and peace-building initiatives. The state used its military police force, considered one of the world's most experienced forces in urban operations, with various degrees of support and involvement by the army and navy to retake the slums from criminal groups and occupy them. So each slum chosen to host a pacifying force, as they came to be known, hosted a base for the Pacifying Police Unit, or UPP, OPP. This was in stark contrast with the preceding approach, prevailing for decades, of conducting occasional raids with armored vehicles in search of high-value targets and with heavy firepower, usually lasting a few hours or just one day. One of the main shifts there took place in the manner in which authorities viewed the aims of the security effort. The old objective of dismantling drug cartels was called a utopia by the current Security Secretary and father of the pacification program, José Mariano Beltrami. Securing key spaces in order to pave the way for other state institutions became the main aim of the new strategy. Current authorities openly recognize that the struggle is for territorial control, even though the main opponents are criminal groups with no political aim. As a result of that, one of the most symbolic images of the program is now the planting of the Brazilian flag on top of every hilltop slum that receives a UPP base. The strategy worked wonders, for a time at least. Like in Medellín, the opportunity provided by the flight of criminal gangs from slums allowed the state to implement development and infrastructure projects, including a cable car identical to the one in Medellín, and reorient the military police from a tool in a vicious cycle of urban warfare towards a stabilization force able to build the guarantees for development. Both cases, Rio and Medellín, initiated a reassessment not only of the utility of force in cities, but also of the framework used to understand security policies in cities. When we hear the Rio Security Secretary explaining how the territory is the key aim in his strategy, or the military authorities in Colombia saying how smooth is the coordination with the police in Medellín, we can see that they are moving away from a framework of classic law enforcement. There has been a recognition that in the growing lawlessness of some large and mega cities, the classic roles of the police in building trust among communities and focusing on investigations, for instance, have to coexist with harder militarized roles. At the same time, there is a move away from a purely military approach based on raids and targeted killings in slums, which does little to create stability, as we all know. This new approach, this middle ground approach, is gradually expanding and can be seen in other successful cases, such as Ciudad Juárez in Mexico. The Rio experience, for instance, is now being studied by El Salvador. Some analysts compare this approach, especially in Rio, to counterinsurgency. Indeed, the autobiography of Rio Security Secretary reads like a counterinsurgency manual at some points. But I see it a bit differently. The operations there resemble more closely stabilization operations. The framework for understanding stabilization operations is still relatively recent. At its most basic, it consists of the use of security force to produce a range of political and economic goals that support violence reduction. Things like building and protecting infrastructure, patrolling unstable areas, supporting political processes. But the key similarity with what is being done in cities like Rio and Medellín is that the aim of stabilization goes beyond a purely military or developmental objective. As the UK Joint Doctrine publication on stabilization makes clear, and I quote, "The ultimate aim for the military commander is to make his adversaries irrelevant to such an extent that the other agencies can deliver their elements of the solution. The role of force, therefore, is placed within a broader state effort that will determine its success or failure, as opposed to the primacy of defeating an adversary." This framework is increasingly useful to analyze developments in large and mega cities. That is because of the trends I mentioned at the beginning, related to population growth and urban sprawl. These trends pave the way for armed groups that are part of the city itself, rather than external invaders. So defeating an enemy and an endemic security problem becomes a much more complex task, requiring a much wider range of state tools. Going back to our brief case studies, both Medellín and Rio demonstrated how the urban environment requires a specific calibration of security tools, from the armed forces all the way to basic service provisions such as trash collection. In both cases, military and police forces were understood as pieces of a broader strategy in which the utility of force was crucial but limited. Force was viewed as useful to the extent that it was able to create a stable environment for initial peacebuilding effort. Striking this balance is no small feat for Latin America, a region that has become so associated with excessive brutality by its security forces. I see this new approach as being part of a broader and more global trend of reassessment and flexibility in the use of force during situations of protracted armed violence. This is linked, for instance, to the increasing emphasis on civilian components during peacekeeping operations, many of which carry the word stabilization in their title. Police contingents have been increasingly called for these missions and are instructed to operate in a spectrum that goes from non-lethal to lethal force as circumstances dictate. The literature around stabilization and peacekeeping has also called attention to the so-called security gap, a lapse in public security in post-conflict environments due to the lack of policing capabilities despite an influx of military forces. Rapid urban growth, and I'm coming to my conclusion now. So rapid urban growth in fragile or violence-afflicted countries puts cities at a prominent position in the list of global policy changes for the current century. This has been increasingly recognized, not least by the United Nations, which, as you know, set a specific goal of making cities sustainable, safe, and resilient at the post-2015 development agenda. So these new development goals, in turn, make these experiments in urban law enforcement even more important as we assemble a roadmap for the future. Stabilizing urban environments is a crucial task for security development. After all, large and mega cities, to put it simply, are too big to fail. In other words, they are crucial drivers of economic and social development, especially in fragile or post-conflict environments. This only makes the task of understanding urban stabilization more urgent than ever. So I hope you see this as an initial attempt, and I'm open for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you all for listening. And once again, if you would like to ask a question, please do so by using the chat function. We can already see some questions queuing up, and we'll just read them out loud for the benefit of everyone. The first one comes from Adam Gibson from the IISS. He asked, to what extent does the militarization of police in megacities provoke and add fuel to the issue of violence in urban environments?
Yeah, just to kind of contextualize what I just said, it is a very initial attempt, and because of time, we didn't have time to go into details about the many dimensions of both Medellín and Rio. They both have their critics. They both have people saying that they failed or they didn't work. In Rio, for instance, we see that the main law enforcement agency there is the military police. So Rio has a civilian police that is dedicated exclusively to investigations, criminal investigations, and the role of law enforcement in the streets is conducted by the military police, which is an agency that traces back to the era of colonization as a tool for, repression of the colony, and later was used by the military dictatorship in Brazil, the military regime there. And now, I mean, there are many, criticisms that the military police is overly brutal and sometimes still is too far away from that aim of community policing, proximity policing. The thing is that if you ask most security authorities, they will say that, in many cities, they will say that, of course, proximity policing is their targets, what they're trying to do. That's what the Rio authorities say. That's what Medellín has, to some extent, achieved. However, in some environments, military or paramilitary forces are increasingly called upon by the populations or becoming a political solution for a short-term influx of security in some areas. So, of course, that the excessive or predominant or primary application of force, as I mentioned here, does little to nothing and can, escalate tensions. To some extent, I would say that that's what happened in Karachi, for instance, where the army is increasingly, being seen as an element in the security equation there. But when broader development and longer-term development tools are not applied, then it becomes a cycle of violence that tends to escalate.
Thank you. The next question will be the one from Stefan Vash from AstraZeneca. Stefan asks whether these governments have any plans to restrict access to firearms.
That's an interesting question, because recently one of the main characters in my narrative today, Secretary Beltrami of Rio, he made a statement that became a headline in one of the main newspapers there, saying that the AK-47 is his worst enemy. So it is famously a difficult task, right, to restrict or block small arms flows. And I mean, much of the small arms that are available in the examples we cited, so in Latin America, come from the civil wars during the 80s and early 90s. So that's a difficult task to accomplish, and as we know, Latin America has very sophisticated and well-connected networks of smuggling that are able to smuggle small arms. In Brazil, the debate about small arms possession, or the civilian legal possession of small arms, is a growing debate. I mean, it's still legal and would have a positive impact, in my view, in reducing, at least in the middle term, the violence, and that is supported by the security authorities. But it is an ongoing challenge, and I think the whole world is waiting for solutions on how to more effectively restrict small arms.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Grant Sutherland from Wood Mackenzie. He asks, how are policymakers addressing corruption in the middle ground approach?
Corruption among security forces, I presume. It's a very difficult challenge in Latin America, because we know that it's a region that has still very fragile institutions. Overall, the focus on having a more proximity-based approach, so police agents that are closer to the population, helps in creating these links with communities, and there has been a reduction in the cities I mentioned in the sort of complaints about police corruption and even police violence against civilians. This, despite some very high level and high visibility incidents that have harmed efforts, especially in Rio de Janeiro and, for instance, in Mexican cities. So Yeah, the corruption challenge remains, and one of the main tools that the security authorities have applied, and to some extent successful, has been the change in the way that these police officers are evaluated. How the progression in the force is benchmarked. So instead of having accounts of the number of killings or the number of arrests, they are evaluated according to the level of population satisfaction with them, the number of complaints, and the overall number of criminal actions that took place in the communities where they're based. So the evaluation of these security agents has a positive impact in corruption. But overall, there is a longer term challenge of educating these forces. For instance, the Brazilian police, the Rio military police, they undergo human rights kind of stabilization, let's say, a training of human rights approaches, proximity policing, contact communication with the population, close contact with civilians for about a week or a little more than that. They don't have time in their busy schedules to undergo more training. So I think that the issue of training of these security agents is also very important for tackling corruption, and that's something that has to do with the level of sustainability, the resources that the state has in hands to be able to provide a longer, more careful training for their forces without compromising police presence or military presence in other areas of the city.
Okay, thank you, Antonio. Talking about training, we also now have a question about the professionalization of policing that was sent by David Maris at the University of California. He asks, the professionalization of policing, especially in terms of collecting evidence and the manner in which they interact with citizens, are often seen as fundamental pieces. The Tijuana police have recently decided to use body cameras as a means to both stimulate police attention to how they police and increase citizen support for them. Do you see a future in body cameras for police in confronting urban violence?
Yes, I see a very promising future in terms of technology in general. I think that the use of, for instance, mobile technology, apps, social media. The Garapé Institute in Rio is doing a tremendous job in implementing apps or studying and implementing apps that help the broader community to, the local community to report crime in real time. And that, of course, helps police and creates a more direct line of contact between police and civil society. So, and the issue of cameras, I guess it's a matter of how well they are used, right? So if there is a way of a civil society agent centralizing these camera feeds and reporting on them or supervising them, I guess it's an instrument of surveilling the police and safeguarding against human rights and kind of incompetence, let's put it this way, of these police agencies. So yes, I see a very bright future for technology, and that's one of the main issues that we want to look at in the future. What is the role of social media? What is the role of new technologies, mobile technologies, cameras? And how, I think a key question would be, how is civil society interacting with that, and how is the state mediating this interaction and allowing the access of civil society to these technologies that help in supervising or policing the police, let's put it this way.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonio. We now can move to the next question. That comes from the Brazilian Army, from retired Colonel Leal, is saying, the handbook of the Organization for American States considers the constabulary function, which is considered as something like gendarmerie, the future role of the military, as as stated in the handbook. So his question is, what is your perception on the role of constabulary function in the underdeveloped countries? Is it only for these countries or not? Thank you.
I think, as I stated in my presentation, I think it's a growing trend, which the role of the military forces in internal law enforcement, for good or evil. I think that Latin America has undergone in the past decade, I think, a revision of this involvement. So in 2006, we saw the launch of the war on drugs in Mexico with a heavy use of the armed forces. And, I think practically all of the Latin American countries facing, high levels of criminality have deployed at some point or another the armed forces for internal security. And that it was driven by a sort of panic reaction or emergency. I think that, and I think most of the literature around, criminal violence, criminality, security studies in Latin America conclude that it was basically a failure. However, more recently, and as I tried to explain in my presentation, we see a more middle ground approach of establishing agencies like the Gendarmerie in Mexico that have the roles that the Army or the Navy cadets or Marines were conducting in the initial phases of this militarization, but the attempt of having more of a civilian oversight, more human rights awareness, and overall a better preparation or a better strategy to how to deal with close proximity to civilian agencies. Whether it was successful or not, I think in Mexico, I personally don't see a lot of difference between the Gendarmerie and, the army or even the federal police in some instances. So I think there has to be a little bit more clarity. But in the cities where I'm arguing that this middle ground approach has been more successful and has established a better framework for understanding the problem of urban security, which is Medellín, Rio, to some extent Ciudad Juárez. I think that this awareness of what is the right calibration of tools. So the military force can only be applied in very specific situations. And there has to be a stronger focus on having civilian agencies, civilian police agencies capable of having this operating this spectrum, along this spectrum of force, from going from something close proximity policing to a kinetic military approach when confronted by these armed challenges, criminals that unfortunately are still an element that has to be considered in the security strategies.
Thank you, Antonio. The next question comes from Alex Curry from the Institute of Latin American Studies. Is asking, to what extent do urban stabilization operations involve a tacit acknowledgement and in some cases tolerance of the role that violent non-state actors play in the provision of security? For example, the paramilitary structures in Medellín.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It is very, very complicated because we all know that non-state actors do provide, do fulfill some roles of governance, and that their basic emergence is, that's a very widespread kind of conclusion of the literature around violent non-state groups, that they emerge in the vacuum of the state or in instances of weak state presence. So there's no such thing as ungoverned spaces, right? So these non-state groups do provide, and I think in urban areas that is stronger. That is a stronger trend. For instance, when you look at Colombia, we see that criminal groups in rural areas don't tend to provide much governance or much security for the populations because they can operate in a larger area. They don't have to control one specifically. So they operate, for instance, with illegal mining, but they don't have to, secure those areas with armed force very strongly because the state simply is not very present. But when you reach urban areas, like Medellín, you see that there has been a stronger focus of non-state groups to really control areas, control Islams, and protect them with armed force, because the state, it tends to have a higher degree of presence in urban areas. So even though the services and institutions are not there, the security forces tend to have a stronger presence. So the non-state armed groups provide the governance, but they also establish kind of thuggish agreements, let's put it this way, with the populations. So it's not an ideal form of governance. In the case of Rio, we see now, and that's why I think Rio is such an interesting case study. We see that there is a real confrontation, a real dispute between state and non-state actors for governance. So, as Wanda Felbach-Brown put it very, very good in one of her works, it is a challenge, it is a dispute for governance between state and non-state actors, which is basically playing out mostly in Latin America. So ideally, the aims of the pacification process of bringing state institutions are the better end result for these populations, because they connect them to the state services, such as basic things like trash collection, mail delivery, very basic things that we take for granted. But when the communities are controlled by non-state actors, they tend to not have these basic things, including, for instance, sanitation in many slums, not only in Latin America. So I think it's inevitable that the state will, and we can argue whether it should, but will pursue its control of governance in urban areas, in these urban slums. So I was asked the exact same question in a debate we had at International Alert about peace in our cities. And it's basically a matter of to what extent the state is ready to accept the non-state groups, and to what extent is the non-state groups willing to exert a non-armed role. So let's take El Salvador, for instance. There, the gangs, engaged in a truce negotiation with civil society. Some say with the state as well, although the state denies it. So if had the truce been successful, I mean that would be a very interesting example of how an armed non-state actor can become a peaceful, a peace broker in fragile communities. But I think we're a long way from being able to draw a conclusion on that, and I think circumstances vary, of course.
Okay. Now a slightly different question from Sonia Peterendo from Wired. This is a research question. She's asking how you went about conducting research on these cities and which methodology you've used, such as interview with police officials and so on.
Yeah, we've been looking at these issues for about slightly over a year. So the issues we're talking here are very initial. Most of my work has been conducted in Rio, although we also conducted field research in Medellín. And we interviewed security authorities, including the security secretaries in both Rio and Medellín, and experts extensively in these areas. But we do plan to expand the research recently in the coming future.
Okay. Now we can move on to a question by Lindsay Clatterbeck, who's an independent researcher analyst. He's asking how much of this new approach is created by giving the military a police role as opposed to militarizing the police in order to deal with the violence? Or is it there a gendarmerie-like middle path?
I think yes, I think the growing consensus or the approaches that have had more repercussion in Latin America and are becoming more of an example tend to have this third path that you mentioned, a gendarmerie-like force That was, the main security approach by Peña Nieto in Mexico with the gendarmerie. In Rio, we see that, it's the military police, which is a gendarmerie-like faction. But I don't think there is one approach that will be the prevailing or the recipe. For instance, Medellín achieved great success in applying mostly police forces, but also using the army as a deterrence for criminal groups. So I think that each city has to evaluate, what tools it has at its disposal. For instance, it is a openly stated goal of the Rio authorities to move away from militarized police force, which is unfortunately called the military police, towards a proximity policing force. So maybe in the future we'll see that police force changing its name. But I think the main point that we can apply to the security policies or this emerging framework that I'm mentioning is connected to the way that security authorities view the role of force. So this very careful calibration as a way of establishing stability in areas in order to bring other state agencies, other state tools. And I'm very conscious that it's not a new approach, but it's an approach that is gaining momentum, and it's gaining acceptance and being, we have now the first, few cases in which we can study how it went about for a few years and therefore draw a few initial conclusions, as I tried to do with Rio and Medellín. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, the circumstances vary, but it's the role, the way that they view the role of force that is the main issue that has to be present at these strategies.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question from Captain Kevin Fleming from the British Ministry of Defence. He's saying much of the language you have been using today would not be out of place in the military counterinsurgency debate. Is there any benefit in reframing organised crime as an insurgency, both from a policymaker's perspective and in the legal framework development, and also in terms of coordinated training and deployment with perhaps the wider state military? And he's also adding, in including across international borders, as much as organised crime, of course, crosses many of those borders.
That is another controversial issue because usually the use of the term insurgency for countries that face criminal violence is not seen as a very not a very acceptable term. I remember, for instance, the school of thought in the US that promoted the criminal insurgency analytical argument, if you will, a few years ago for what was happening in Mexico, because there, there is an argument that the organized criminal groups, they challenge state authority and the monopoly of force in specific areas. So they don't want to overthrow the government, and instead, indeed, they benefit from the stability and the predictability that a stable government, central government provides. So the criminal groups benefit from the services that the state provides, the stability, the international trade routes, and many other things. So they don't want to overthrow the central government or even state governments. They want to infiltrate them from within. So all of that to say that in some instances, as I try to explain here, these armed groups, they do challenge the state authority in some specific areas, but they are very restricted because it's difficult to find an example of an entire city, that is kind of controlled by criminal groups. You see that with, insurgencies in Iraq and unfortunately in Afghanistan now as well. But you don't see that in Latin America. You see, very widespread criminality and a very strong control by criminal groups in some areas, but not entire cities, because they don't want to, be seen very visibly as a dominant force in order not to attract too much response by the state forces. So having said that, I think the focus on the population being the center of gravity, which is a classic counterinsurgency recipe, if you will, is remarkably well placed in urban security, frameworks of Latin America. And as I said here, the autobiography that was launched by the Rio Security Secretary Beltrami reads very much like counterinsurgency literature. On the matter of international borders, I think that is an interesting environment to study, and I think there are many studies on that. I don't look at that very closely, but it tends to be a more of an area for military forces, because even in countries that don't face insurgencies, international borders tend to be the area of responsibility for the army or the navy sometimes when there are rivers. So it tends to have a stronger application of military force. So I mean, there are elements. So in summary, there are elements of counterinsurgency frameworks that can be useful to the debate. But I think that recently the academic and policy-making communities in Latin America, as far as I'm concerned, have moved away from using the term insurgency in their criminology studies and strategy making.
Yes, I think this debate around the definitions that we should be using to describe these challenges is something that is interesting for many of our participants. Paulo Cesar Leal from Brazil is asking another question, and in fact ask you to say a few words on the relationship between the fight against these challenges and the concept of hybrid warfare, which is something that we in our program and other colleagues at IISS have been doing some thinking on. So Paulo is asking whether this is actually a new threat, or only an old one with a new name. What do you think, Antonio?
I mean, hybrid war is used for so many situations, right? I do think that what is happening in cities like Rio de Janeiro, Ciudad Juarez, San Pedro Sula in Honduras, and to that extent, Karachi in Pakistan, to some extent in South Africa as well, this sort of hyper-intensity criminal violence with, military-style weaponry, it is hybrid because it uses tools that have traditionally been considered the domain of insurgent groups, or even sometimes military groups, in a context of criminality for economic benefits of these criminal actors. So, for instance, we saw recently in Mexico, one of the most significant security developments recently in Mexico has been the rise of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, which at least for a few months during the middle of the year, more or less, applied remarkably bold criminal tactics, including ambushes, very sophisticated ambushes against the armed forces, against the police. They downed a few Mexican helicopters from the military, from the police. In Brazil, I remember in 2010 when I was still there, they also downed a military police helicopter there. So, I mean, it is hybrid in the tactics, but I think we shouldn't try to make it too new, because in the end it is perhaps an escalation of criminal violence that we have been seeing for a few decades. And I think if I say, yeah, it is a hybrid, it is completely new, there will always be arguments that, in the 70s and 80s, some of these cities were facing some of the same problems. And again, I'm a bit too addicted to narcos. If you look at Medellín, you see that Pablo Escobar was doing many of those criminal violence approaches and being very bold and linking with terrorist groups a few decades ago. So it is not completely new, I would say, but it is a hybrid form. But I think that the term hybrid warfare is increasingly linked to the sort of proxy warfare that we see in Ukraine. The ability of non-state groups to conduct a sort of warfare, an armed campaign that benefits the state, but providing a very useful deniability for the state that supports these non-state groups. So the tactical power at the hands of non-state groups globally has increased significantly in the past years and decades, right? So I think there is a global trend towards, a balance of a greater ability of non-state groups to challenge state authority. So in that sense, Latin America and the countries that face this sort of criminal violence are part of a global trend. But I wouldn't, find very useful to lump criminal groups in Latin America with hybrid warfare.
Thank you, Antonio. Well, you mentioned the transnational aspects of these urban challenges, and Chris Oxtra from the University College London is asking whether these domestic response operations coincide with any particular cooperative international measures.
Does the response coincide with any particular cooperative international measures? I don't see an international framework for urban operations yet. I mean, the international dimension that I included here, which I do find, that there are parallels, but they're not yet particularly related, is, for instance, the foreign police units in the UN peacekeeping operations, which has been something that has been increasingly called for in both by the missions themselves, the mission leaders, especially in the situations of protracted violence in sub-Saharan Africa and Haiti. This broader combination of police and military tools. One example that links the international to the local arenas very well is Haiti and Rio. So there is research at King's College London and the Brazil Institute pointing out to the ways that the Haiti operation, the peacekeeping operation in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, influenced very strongly the peacekeeping, the pacification program in Rio. So in Haiti, the peacekeeping forces, they saw, that they had to do something about the gangs in Cité Soleil, a slum in Port-au-Prince. So they invaded the slum and, with the traditional military hardware, if you will, and then they implemented policing tools there, and then the same type of balanced combination of tools was used to stabilize the area and bring state services and peace building initiatives. And that was in Haiti, and that was, remarkably similar to what is being currently tried at the slums of Rio de Janeiro. In both cases, we saw that these policies face significant challenges from criminal armed actors that respond to these initiatives. So I think there is an international perhaps consensus being built of the need to use the stabilization framework, this continuum, right, that allows flexibility in the application of law enforcement and military tools to support peace building. However, the international debate on these issues is still, I would say, underdeveloped. And the UN, for instance, I think it's remarkable that it does not include the urban lens for its peacekeeping, thinking. So the recent documents, reviews that were released this year on the request by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the reviews on peacekeeping and peace building, especially the one on peacekeeping, simply ignores the urban dimension, any specific tools that are recommended or thought for urban areas. So I think there is a space for an international debate and kind of an integration of the urban stabilization lens into the thinking of international organizations and international peacekeeping forces. So, for instance, when countries are preparing their forces or their peacekeeping schools, having a lens that looks at urban specific challenges would be very useful, but that simply is not there yet.
Thank you, Antonio. Colonel Leal from Brazil is asking your opinion on whether you think it's better to have a centralized police or a decentralized one, and he's reminding us that in Brazil there are two organizations, a civilian police and also a military police. So what do you think works best?
Oh, that's a tough one. What I can say is that I think the trend towards a very fragmented policing structure in countries tends to have, negative effects in countries where we see, fragile institutions or a history of fragile institutions or corruption. So that is, a long-standing diagnosis or conclusion by the literature, by the academia of Mexico. So Mexico has, hundreds of local police units, has, sometimes state police agencies, and the federal police and the gendarmerie. So it's now trying to implement the single command, the mando único, which is a way of allowing the central government, the federal government, and the state governments to have more control over these local police forces. So the argument is that the local police forces are more easily corrupted, are less prepared because the training and the vetting of these local police forces tends to vary so tremendously from town to town, city to city. So an element of centralization is definitely important. But I think, again, the context varies from country to country. And sometimes in terms of big cities, I think it would be difficult not to have some element of local policing. But in terms of, what we're talking about, stabilization operations, it requires a very, very specialized, very well-trained, very specific kind of skills. I think a central element, I would argue, would be more appropriate because it requires such specific set of skills. But it is a contentious issue. It is a difficult question to end this webinar, but because so many people would argue that there are local forces in Mexico that are better. Have better track record than the federal police and things like that. So I think the debate is still ongoing.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to host this webinar, to see such high levels of participation from our audience, and also to be reading such a very sharp set of questions. Clearly, this is a topic that is of great interest. It's something that we are going to develop going forward. Antonio, perhaps can you tell us a bit of what you are planning to do to expand this research we've been conducting so far?
Yeah, as it became clear in the questions, cities are adopting many combinations of security tools, and although I try to look through a stabilization prism, and I think that is increasingly useful to understand cities. I think it is important to conduct field research in as many cities as possible. So we're trying now to look at some examples, or how this prism, how well or how not so well it fits within some of the developments in African cities, for instance. So I'm very interested in looking at sub-Saharan Africa as it faces a very rapid population growth in its cities. So we're trying to expand this program and look at Africa, South Asia, and develop further this urban stabilization research.
Excellent. And also for those of you who are interested in the Rio case studies, the IISS has recently published a Stratcom looking at the criminal gangs in Rio de Janeiro and the security strategy that's being developed there. So you just check our website for this latest Stratcom. At this point, I'd like to bring the discussion to a close. Thank you, Antonio, for your presentation, and thank you all in the audience for your participation and questions. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our website in the upcoming days, so please do look out for that if you'd like to listen to it again, or indeed to pass the link on to your colleagues. Join us again soon for another webinar, but good night.